Good games are difficult to find in our present situation. Between culture war custodians, critics with deadlines to have their reviews on their editors' desks by 9 a.m. on Thursday, and influencers whose opinions can be purchased for the cheap price of a free steelbook and an embroidered index card, whose word can we take on what games are worth playing? To say that my opinion on one game is the only one worth listening to would be vastly self-indulgent. But the mentality behind making such a statement is one that every video game player should have. The only person whose opinion matters to me is myself. And this is the way you should think too. I can't mandate to you over this screen that you should or shouldn't enjoy a certain game, but I can explain my reasoning for why I've come to that opinion. It's up to you to decide whether I'm right or wrong. With that established, I can tell you with full conviction that Avowed is, in fact, a good game. It's a game that surprised me with how strictly it adheres to its intentions. Developed by Obsidian Entertainment, Avowed gracefully avoids the traps that so many other AAA, open-area, high-profile games fall into. There's a level of artistic integrity that Obsidian managed to stick with. The end result is a game that was well worth my time, and I imagine it would be worth yours. Avowed takes place in Aora, which may sound like a rare skin condition, but is actually the fantasy world created by Obsidian. Aora was introduced in the studio's 2015 game Pillars of Eternity, a title which has sadly fallen out of the public consciousness when one brings up the acronym POE. In preparation for Avowed, I gave Pillars of Eternity a shot, and it's a cool game, but not one I have the patience for right now. It's a very story-driven RPG, and at times can feel like you're reading a book more than you're playing a game. I'm sure that's all well and good with some people, but I prefer my books to be books and my games to be games. But in my brief time with it, I was able to see some of the elements of the world that Pillars of Eternity created that found their way into various parts of Avowed. Avowed takes place in a new region of Aora, an island known as the Living Lands. Equal parts untamed frontier and self-contained cultural monuments, the Living Lands is not a welcoming place, but few places in fantasy are. Ah yes, another fantasy game. We've had a lot of those lately, haven't we? But thankfully, Avowed does make a considerable effort to set itself apart from those other fantasy games that we may label as grotesquely generic. A fantasy setting may be fine in isolation, but when it's placed next to 50 others exactly like it, it becomes difficult to give any of them preferential treatment. So what is the creator of a fantasy world to do? Introduce too many unique elements, and you risk distancing your world too far from why people gravitate towards fantasy in the first place. Play it too safe, and why bother making the game at all? Fortunately for Avowed, this is a tightrope it walks on with impressive agility. Some fantasy staples are certainly there: dwarves and elves, combat by way of spell and sword, and overall primitive technology. But at the same time, there's more to it. The game doesn't settle for the public domain fantasy races that appear just about everywhere, but also creates a few of its own. There's Almawa, a species of tall, scale-covered fish people, which almost certainly took some inspiration from the Zora in The Legend of Zelda, but still managed to provide a unique flavor to the world. Then there's Orlins, which are furry little elf-like things that are few and far between, but you can't say that they aren't memorable. Graphically, these two new races look exceptionally well detailed, and are able to add variety to the game without being overly distracting. The NPCs you'll end up fighting the majority of the time will be either humans, reanimated skeletons, or these little dinosaur men known as Zaurips. The Zaurips have a fine design, but they aren't particularly interesting. Skeletons obviously aren't anything original, but they do work well as a common enemy type. But in terms of things to kill in a game, I'll always prefer the humans. Fighting another human being in a game feels like it has much more meaning behind it than when you're fighting some monster. In a battle against a skeleton or a Zaurup, you know there's no way they could be on the morally correct side of things. But a human? Now you have to question yourself, even if a little bit. We might not consider taking down a reanimated skeleton murder, but that's not the case with humans. But even though human characters are about as plain as the hallways of a doctor's office, Avowed does a good job of peppering them in with enough assortment to make each person feel unique. While British accents might be the default for most fantasy settings, Avowed sprinkles in a good few American accents, but the Living Lands on the whole is surprisingly Italian. This is true for multiple areas, but but especially the Emerald Stair. Thanks to the characters' names and deliveries, its capital, Fiormesiverno, manages to feel much closer to Florence than to Rivendell. Italians certainly aren't an underrepresented nationality in video games, but they are uncommon in RPGs, so it's nice to see this type of variety. Then comes the matter of the environments of Avowed. There's 4 main areas to the game, each of which gets more and more grim as you venture into them. You start off with the generic, pleasant green grass of Dawnshore, then onto the wild forests of Emerald Stair, then the discouraging desert of Shatterscarp, and finally the stone belt that sits under the scowling volcano of Gallowayne's Tusks. Each of these areas can be divided into 2 sections, the cities and the wilds. The narrative structure of each area will follow the same basic format. Get to the city, figure out what the big problem is, and go out on a number of quests looking to solve it. It's a pretty standard way of going about things in a game, but one that works well thanks to how the environments are laid out. Here's where the game's biggest strength lies, because Avowed is a very dense game. In both the cities and the outdoor areas, there's very little wasted space. Very few moments of walking along without anything interesting popping up in front of you. In fact, it's hard to keep walking in a straight line at all. The map offers much more verticality than you may be used to seeing in an RPG, especially one with a first-person view. It doesn't have the massive cliffs you can climb up like in Breath of the Wild, but with the basic vaulting and jumping that the game gives you, you're able to truly move in 3 dimensions. This makes the world feel more real, because you can bet that if you were actually on this adventure, you'd have to do your fair share of climbing and jumping. It also makes exploration more interesting. You don't look at a cliff and think, oh, how can I find a way around that? You look at a cliff and go, okay, I could go around it, but let's see if I can find my way up to the top. It's through this, but not only this, that Avowed is able to achieve a sense of discovery, one that's not accomplished by many other modern games. As a first-person fantasy RPG from a studio with historic ties to Bethesda, Avowed won't be able to escape comparisons to the king of the genre, Skyrim. And Skyrim is a very impressive game, especially considering it came out in 2011. And what's most impressive about it is its sense of discovery. When playing Skyrim for the first time, it feels like you can stumble upon anything at any moment. Around any given quarter, there could be a dungeon, a bandit camp, a settlement, anything. Players are right to look back on the game and have their gripes about the combat or the quest design or the over-infestation of Draugr, but they have to acknowledge what Skyrim was able to achieve with its vast and varied overworld. Since the first time I played Skyrim in 2013, there's only been a few games that have been able to give me this same sense of discovery, where it feels like I can stumble around a seemingly unimportant corner and find an entire world waiting for me behind it. These are games like Breath of the Wild, Baldur's Gate 3, and Elden Ring. Some of the greatest games of all time, made by teams that have been honed over decades? Without a doubt, but this high watermark is something that other game studios should attempt to hit. Avowed has shot its shot, and it hit a bullseye. You might set out from any of the given cities in the game intending to go straight to the next main story objective, but that very rarely ends up being what actually happens. Instead, it's incredibly easy to get pulled away into all sorts of different directions. Lured away from your intended path by someone calling for help, a suspicious-looking building, or the sound of a treasure chest. Yes, not the sight of a treasure chest, but the sound of one. To help the player locate treasure, Avowed has taken a page out of Fortnite's book and made each stash of loot audibly call out with a luring melody. It functions so similarly that it has to have been an idea the developers pulled directly from Fortnite, but hey, if it works, it works. But discovery wouldn't be possible if the player knew too much about the environments that they're in. That's part of what made the map system of Breath of the Wild so unique at the time. There's quite a lot there in the world to find, but they didn't tell you where any of it was. Avowed approaches this in a way that's similar in philosophy, but different in manner. The map screen also tells you very little about what's around you, but there's no towers to climb and sections of the map to unlock. Instead, the map fills in as you move through it, in a way that's similar to how the maps work in Minecraft. In this function, it tells you where you have been, but also tells you where you haven't been. In Elden Ring, there's definitely been more than a few places I've skipped over because I wasn't aware that I hadn't already been there. No thanks to the map. But in Avowed, there's no possibility of a mistake like that. If I've been there, it's been colored in. The idea of filling up the map as much as possible is one that sounds both fun and gratifying to me, and it's probably the top reason I can see myself one day returning to the game. Though as great as the map is, it does have some room for improvement. One thing that I'm absolutely shocked isn't there is the ability to place markers down as a way to remind yourself to come back there later. Avowed's enemies don't scale with your level, which means you can walk into a spot with enemies that will utterly destroy you until you come back with more experience and better weapons. That's all well and good, but the fact that you can't place a pin on the map as the way of saying, hey, I should come back here when I get the chance, feels like a very obvious miss. What makes the lack of this simple quality of life feature more astounding is that Avowed is a game that's packed full of convenience. Comparing new weapons and armor to what you already have equipped is clear and simple. Sprinting doesn't cost any stamina, which very much helps when you want to get to a specific place as fast as possible. The ability to pull up dialogue history in a conversation is very much appreciated. Honestly, it should be illegal to ship a game without this feature. And if you're going to go the extra mile here to even put lore information in with the dialogue history, why can't you let me put markers on the map? But putting this aside, the way the map lets you discover things works fantastically. And there's a lot to discover. While the game has its main narrative, of course, sprinkled throughout it are innumerable vignettes for the player to discover. You won't explore an area to just find a new piece of armor. You'll find a character, or multiple characters, with their own backstory, needs, and goals. There will even be dialogue options you can choose from in order to decide what way their story will play out. These are all categorized in the game as side quests, but it feels diminishing to describe them as such, when participating in them is essential to getting the best adventure possible out of Avowed. I tend to skip side quests fairly often in games, since they tend to amount to pointless busy work rather than quests that enhance the experience. But these side quests are the experience. Each one is meaningful, and on the first playthrough there's seemingly no end to them. It's through these bite-sized adventures that Avowed is able to capture that same feeling of wild discovery that Skyrim had. True to what many of these characters will tell you, the Living Lands aren't a safe place, with any manner of monster, skeleton, and human trying to kill you at any given moment. Going into Avowed, how the combat would fare was the biggest question on my mind. Skyrim is the closest frame of reference I had for it, and the combat in that is far from great, so my hopes weren't all too high. However, I'm happy to say, I enjoyed the combat in Avowed quite a bit. I played a melee build, which I usually do in these types of games. I generally stay away from any spellcasting heavy stuff when I can. Every game handles magic differently, and unless it's revolutionary, I prefer hand-to-hand combat. Casting spells changes a lot from game to game, but hitting someone with a sword, that's the tried and true way to murder. I used a one-handed weapon and a shield in the beginning, but about halfway through switched to two-handed weapons, and both options were great. Each hit I landed felt very impactful, and seeing an enemy ragdoll away after you swing an axe into them doesn't get old. Sometimes with weaker enemies it can feel like you're clicking the attack button over and over again, but with the stronger guys you need to give it a bit more thought. In terms of avoiding attacks, you can block, dodge, or parry. Unheard of, I know. I definitely made heavy use of the block. The dodging was helpful, but sidestepping so fast in a first-person game felt a little weird. I enjoyed the parrying too, but I want to point out that in order to parry, it's a skill you have to unlock with an ability point, which is annoying. And speaking of ability points and skill trees, God, can we just be done with these? I don't mind them in theory, but when every game has them, I get so burnt out on the things. There used to be some variety in how a player unlocked skills, but now, spend an ability point in the skill tree, you brainless slob. In addition to the melee weapons, I also made use of a few different ranged weapons. The bows work pretty nicely, and feel a lot more action-y than the bows of other games. But who wants to use a bow when you can use a gun? If World War III is really around the corner, I know what I'd prefer. The guns in Avowed aren't very advanced at all, and require some very long reload times, but they're a ton of fun. I tried the dual-wielding pistols in the beginning, which was neat, but since you can't aim down sights with them, I didn't find them very useful for ranged attacks. Later I switched to long guns, and those were a ton of fun. The way they load one shot at a time with gunpowder makes you feel like a soldier in the Revolutionary War. They do take a long time to reload, but because of that, you treat each shot with more importance. There's no 2009 Modern Warfare 2 pray and spray happening here. You've got to aim with precision. I will add that with both bows and guns, you don't need to worry about ammo. which is very convenient and saves the player a ton of time they'd otherwise be wasting hunting around for spare bullets and arrows. In combat, you have a number of abilities you can activate. You'll have special attacks of your own, but you can also command your companions to execute theirs, many of which can be very useful. Since the game pauses when you bring up this menu, it gives combat almost a hybrid turn-based feel, similar to Final Fantasy VII Remake. It's a smart way to add a bit of slower-paced strategy to what's normally very fast-paced battles. It also helps give your companions some use. It's much easier to make the player care about other members of their party when they're actually helpful, so Avowed does a great job of that. Speaking of the companions, let's say hi to them. You have Kai, the tall and stoic fishman, Marius, the clinically depressed dwarf, Giada, who is my wife, and Yatsley, the sex-crazed wizard Furby. All of these characters have their own things going on, and you learn more about them the further you go. And even though they might not be as interesting as some of the companions of a game like Baldur's Gate 3, they worked well enough to win me over by the end. In the beginning, I thought Kai was just about the most boring character you could imagine, with a boring name to boot. But after learning about the different friends, or maybe lovers, he lost along the way, I saw him for the full fishman that he is. I liked how pessimistic Marius is about everything, and how Giada kept a cool head after something bad happened. I won't spoil it here, but something very bad happened. Might have been my fault. And Yatsley, I get what they were trying to do with her, and she's certainly unique, but she didn't quite land for me. It probably comes down to her voice, honestly. If she sounded different, I probably wouldn't have minded her much at all.
There's a godless artifact just out of reach, and I must have it. But perhaps we don't need one. You're tall, striking, and well-toned.
The great thing about the companions, though, is that they actually interact with people other than the player character. Often when you're in conversation with NPCs, whether they're main quest or side quest characters, your companions will chime in a way that feels very natural. They'll even talk to each other, especially at camp. The Outer Worlds had companions that would occasionally say something to an NPC, but the amount it happens in Avowed is greatly improved. Think about how many lines each actor had to record. Many of them the player won't even hear. You can only bring 2 companions out with you at a time, which means the writers would have had to write different dialogue depending on who was there. This is extra effort I can't give enough appreciation for. It makes the companions feel so much more real, rather than just NPCs you're able to give commands to in battle. There are so many other games where you have a party, but the members in it hardly interact with each other at all. How Avowed handles your companions is exactly how it should be done in games. So I hope other studios are paying attention to what Obsidian has done here. In dialogue scenes with your companions or other NPCs, you'll be given different options to choose how the conversation will go. These range from hopeful and kind to rude and nihilistic. I mostly stayed a good person throughout my run, but I couldn't resist demanding payment for my services when possible. Look, I'll be a good guy, but not for free. What's cool about these dialogue options is that even though you end up choosing only one, you're able to learn more about the world and the character you're speaking with by reading the others. This works very well as a way to give the player more information without causing the cutscenes to drag out too long. And they can get quite long as it is. So a lot of the time, I ended up just reading the captions of whatever the other character was saying and then skipping to the next part before they finished their voice line. In true Obsidian style, such as in Fallout New Vegas and the Outer Worlds, throughout the story you'll be put in pivotal positions, where you'll need to make a major decision that will affect the lives of the characters in the living lands. Now, situations like these are where RPGs can shine. I love impactful choices in games, and Avowed is host to quite a few. I won't spoil any here, but the first major decision comes up when you have to decide whether or not to kill a character that has not been too kind to you. I ended up letting this person live, which some of the other NPCs weren't too happy about. That's how all of these big decisions in Avowed go. You're given 2 options, but both have positive and at times severely negative outcomes. If you're familiar with the Outer Worlds, think of the part in the beginning where you have to cut the power off at either of the 2 settlements. Neither option is great, but it's a choice you have to make in order to progress the story. These types of choices are the kind I love in an RPG. If one option is obviously better than the other, it takes all the tension and grit out of making the call. Yes, a clearly evil choice can be fun every now and then, but it requires a lot less critical thought. It's like how the best villains are the ones that have agreeable intentions, but their methods are where they go too far. Towards the end of the game, there's two major choices you have to make. For the first one, I did what felt right, but I was questioning what to do up until the very moment I had to make my decision. For the final choice in the game, the sides are a little more black and white, but the more evil sounding option did have its benefits too, aside from the satisfaction of just being a jerk. Choices like these are where the overall narrative shines, because the rest of the story is meh. It's not bad, but not nearly as gripping as those of other RPGs. There's a pretty big twist in the back half, which is painfully obvious from the beginning, and many of the characters you meet along the way who need help aren't exactly likable enough to make you want to help them. The most confusing aspect of the story was the dynamic between the people of the Living Lands and those of the Adiran Empire. The Living Lands is a loosely governed outback, under tepid control of the Adiran Empire, which is located on a different landmass. The people of the Living Lands make it clear, time and time again, that they do not like Adirans. There's constant talk of how the Adirans make life worse for all the people living there. But the thing is, you hardly ever see that. For one thing, you rarely meet any other Adirans, so I'm not sure who's supposed to be oppressing the Living Lands in the first place. There's the Steel Garrote, who operate as a brutal military under the Adiran Empire, but at one point even they say that they'll break away from the Adirans and do whatever they want if they don't get their way. So the player is told, constantly, that the Adirans amount to cold-hearted colonizers who are just there to displace the inhabitants and make life worse for everyone. But from what I actually observed of the few Adirans I saw, they seemed more like powerless immigrants than anything else. Maybe this contradiction was intentional, but I don't think so. If it was, I would expect the mistreatment of the Adirans to come up at some point later in the story, but it doesn't. Really, I think it's just an aspect that's poorly executed. If you want to win me over to the side of the Living Lands, you've got to show me some real mistreatment of its people by the Adirans. Because what we have now is everyone constantly telling you how much they hate the Adirans, but the only Adirans you meet are living in a shantytown and being extorted by the locals. And I'm supposed to believe that they're the bad guys? But even though I have these gripes with the main narrative, it didn't negatively affect my enjoyment of the game all that much. The reason for that being, I don't think the overall story really matters. I realize that sounds strange to say about a big RPG with a lot of player choices and many cutscenes, but it's true. Because the story isn't the thing in Avowed. The thing is the setting. The thing is the exploration. The thing is the combat. The thing is the choices you make. Yes, the main narrative holds a lot of those big choices, but many of the more interesting ones come from the side quests. So the story isn't the important part. It's just a vehicle that's used to get the player to all these more important parts. And this sounds crazy, but I actually had this thought after watching a film of the highest cinematic adoration, Eurotrip. That's right, the 2004 raunchy teen comedy taught me something about game design. There's wisdom everywhere, if you know how to look for it. Eurotrip is a movie about a high schooler and his friends traveling through Europe to meet a girl he likes in Germany. That's the plot, but it's not what the movie's about. The movie is about all the misadventures they get up to. Going to a nude beach in France, getting stoned in Amsterdam, living like kings in Eastern Europe. That's the draw, that's the appeal, not the actual story.
But the heart of the movie is traveling around Europe and the misadventures, if you will. That's the real movie.
Right.
And everything else is the device to get them to Europe. The fun is, what do 4 young American kids do in Europe?
It's the same thing for Avowed, and it's true for countless other games. Yes, there's games that rely more pivotally on their narrative, but for most of them, the story is just an excuse for the game to happen. So, Avowed is a game I greatly enjoyed, but in our present world of any game release becoming ammunition for one or more sides of an innumerable number of verbal wars taking place across all corners of the internet, it becomes impossible to examine Avowed without also giving attention to the bigger picture. Avowed is, by and large, a good game. But a good game can't simply be a good game anymore. It has to mean something. The game is good, yes, but who is proven right by this fact? In the era of Twitch streamers turning into bitch streamers, which side comes out the victor when Avowed reaches its well-deserved critical and commercial success? When you launch Avowed, one of the first things your eyes will see is the Xbox Game Studios logo, made just about as big as it can be without bursting out of your screen. And there was a time, not all too long ago, when this game would have been released exclusively on Xbox. No day and date release on PC, no PS5 version down the road, no Nintendo Switch 2 version theoretically bobbing around in the heads of both game players and game executives. No, in another universe not too far off from our own, if you want to play Avowed, it's Xbox or the highway, buddy. Maybe you'll look out and your neighbors will give you their sons after he moves to Austin to work at an AI startup. But if not, be ready to put up or shut up. You don't have to be that old to remember the time when Xbox held equal footing, both culturally and commercially, with Sony and Nintendo. There's no denying that for the majority of the time it's been around, Xbox was a cool console. Aside from Atari, it's the only major American video game console brand. Even though that first generation wasn't the best for sales, it was still something fresh and exciting. And the 360, oh man, that was the console to have. But then, the Xbox One came along. God damn it, we had a good thing going. Why'd you have to ruin it? The 2013 reveal really was the beginning of the end. The focus on TV, the always online requirement, and the dystopian idea of being forced to keep a Kinect camera plugged into it at all times. It's been a while, but I want people to remember the historical context of this. This Xbox One reveal happened right around the same time that the Edward Snowden leaks happened, like literally within weeks. So the idea of being required to put a camera in your living room watching you all hours of the day is a tough pill to swallow at any time. But back then, people were absolutely not having it. Microsoft ended up reversing these decisions, so your Xbox didn't need to be always online, and it didn't require a camera spying on you all the time, but the damage was already done. Maybe they could have crawled out of the hole if they put out some must-have exclusive games, but they didn't. I never owned either a PS4 or an Xbox One, but I knew that if I was gonna get one, why in the world would I have gone with Xbox? The only game they had that looked tempting to me was Sunset Overdrive. That was one game competing with the legions of exclusives that Sony was putting out. So during that generation, I did the only sensible thing and bought a Wii U. It seems that in the late 2010s, the suits at Microsoft realized the problem and began buying up studios left and right, so that someone, anyone, would make them that big exclusive that will get people buying an Xbox. Mojang, Ninja Theory, Double Fine, and Obsidian all came under the Xbox banner, but it was too late. The sun was setting on the Xbox One, but Microsoft still had one final card to play. Game Pass. What a concept! What could go wrong by giving consumers access to all of your games, including day one releases, for one monthly subscription? Honestly, I don't know how anyone couldn't see that this was an idea that was doomed from the start. First of all, the amount of money you have to put into the thing must be ridiculous. You have to keep adding new games in order to get new subscribers and keep your existing ones, either by developing your own games or paying other companies to put theirs on it, neither of which is cheap. And even if you can get that down, by offering Game Pass, you're conditioning your customer base to not buy games. I've never used Game Pass, but I can tell you that if I did, I'd play just about every game on there before I even think about buying another one. It's like if you had an all-you-can-eat buffet that also offered food that you could pay for. If you're already paying for the buffet, why would you pay extra for more? And so in 2020, the Xbox Series X and S release, and it feels like the company has just been trying to keep their heads above the water since then. In what can only be described as acts of desperation, they've started putting their would-be exclusives on other platforms. Every Xbox game goes to PC, on Steam no less, day and date, and they've even been putting out games on the Switch and PS5. I never thought I'd see the day where a Forza game releases on PlayStation, but here we are. I feel like almost every day I see articles about Xbox sales being lower than they've ever been. And I'm no industry expert, but I can't help but things would probably be better if they kept their games only on their platform. I fully realize I benefit from their cross-platform releases. Avowed is a great game which I played on Steam, and I probably wouldn't have bought an Xbox Series X just for Avowed. But if Xbox was the only place I could play Avowed, and Pentiment, and Forza Horizon, and Doom the Dark Ages, and Hi-Fi Rush, and Starfield, and Indiana Jones, and The Outer Worlds 2, I probably would buy one. And if they put out a new Banjo-Kazooie game, I'm buying one instantly. I like that I can play all of these on PC, or even other consoles, but I'd prefer to live in a world where Xbox exists thanks to its exclusive games, to one where it doesn't exist at all. But sadly, the guy who's the head of Xbox says things like this.
But we are not in a position, and I see it out there, I see commentary that if you just build great games, everything would turn around. It's just not true that if we go off and build great games, all of a sudden you're going to see console share shift in some dramatic way.
Avowed could have been a very compelling exclusive game for a lot of people, but for Xbox, it feels like the party's over. It's a definitive win for Obsidian, but with these circumstances, it's not able to be the win that Microsoft so desperately needs. So instead of being a great Xbox game, Avowed is simply a great game. Perhaps what I find most refreshing about it is that it knows not to overextend itself. It's not a particularly long game, especially for an RPG, and it doesn't overstay its welcome. There's features that the development team could have implemented, but they made the right choice in not doing so, and they've created a tighter and more focused experience as a result. NPCs don't move around cities with a day and night cycle, but who cares? They're not there as an attempt to create an illusion of a real world. They're there to explain who they are, give you a quest, and then get out of your way. There's not a massive open world full of empty space. There's a number of smaller, jam-packed areas that leave you with very little downtime in between discoveries. There's only one feature I can think that feels like it's missing, and that's some sort of a theft and wanted system. The fact that you can go into someone's house and take their stuff right out from under them feels a little strange, but it probably would have been too costly to implement, and could have interfered with other parts of the cities, so it's fine. And so, I'm happy to report that with Avowed, Obsidian absolutely nailed it. It's refreshing in its restraint, and impressive in its achievements. Avowed feels like a game that people have been asking for a long time. Okay, when I say people, maybe I just mean me, but look, I'll take that. It's a game that focuses on its strengths and skips over its weaknesses. It's a game that allows the player to make choices that feel actually impactful. It's a game that lets you stumble upon things in a way that makes it feel like you're the one making the discoveries. It's a game that, in a sea of titles designed in corporate boardrooms, feels like something that the developers truly wanted to make.